Hey, welcome to OT Asset Management Weekly. Today we talk about the OT vulnerability management workflow. Why is that an important topic? Maybe the most important topic within OT security. Very simple, because that's your angle towards mitigating risk. Another component of risk would be threats, but unfortunately, you can't do anything about threats. There will always be new threats. They can pop up overnight, and it's very difficult to base your whole OT security approach on threats. That's different with vulnerabilities because you can substantially reduce your attack surface by mitigating those vulnerabilities. And the more you do that, guess what? The less you have to worry about threats, because if your attack surface is very small, then the threat actors can only do so much. So without further ado, let's check out the OT vulnerability management workflow, which you see depicted here. So this is a scientific diagram. This is the structure of the vulnerability management workflow. It's very, very simple. Even a child could do that. It starts with the identification of all your OT vulnerabilities. Once that you have done that, you have to assess those vulnerabilities or individual vulnerabilities in order to determine what you are going to remediate. Now, why do we need that assessment step at all? Just think about it for a second. I believe it's a very interesting point to consider. Why don't we simply remediate all the vulnerabilities that we have identified? There's a very simple reason for that. The remediation is costly. It's very costly in OT because it might involve a firmware update, as an example, very frequently. In other words, you could say OT vulnerability remediation is a compelled configuration change. Compelled means, well, you usually wouldn't like to do that. Everything runs fine. So, but there are reasons that tell you, oh, I really have to. I have to do this firmware update, for example. And because that is costly, you inject this assessment part where you assess if it's actually worth it. That's a very important aspect of the whole process, because just think about it. If remediation was free, then everybody would do it for every single vulnerability. But that's not the case, especially in OT. For many remediation tasks, such as firmware updates, you will need downtime. That's another point to consider. When could you actually do the remediation? So some people approach this in a very, let's just say, simplistic manner, in a naive manner, so to say, because they tell you, oh, this vulnerability is so critical that you have to patch it or update it now. You have to remediate now. Yes, but if it involves a downtime event, then it's not going to happen. So you will have to wait for the next scheduled outage. But in principle, this process is very, very simple. And the problems come with execution. So not because the process would be so complex. No, some pieces of this process are very difficult to execute. However, some users actually make their lives much harder than they had to because they approach it in the wrong way. And this all starts with the identification stage, because this is how many OT security professionals start their identification. They browse through those security alerts. They might come from CISA, they might come from the vendor, such as Rockwell or Siemens, okay? And then they, there is this nasty new vulnerability, and let's check if we are affected by that. And unfortunately, I have to break it to you. If you actually start your vulnerability management in this manner, you will never make any progress, because that's just a gigantic waste of time. This identification piece can be fully automated. Just think about that. The problem with this manual browsing of alerts is that not only is it time consuming, but it will always leave you with, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities that you will miss. Trust me, we have seen that over and over again. So the identification piece cannot be done manually. That's the long and short of it. If you still engage in this activity, you are wasting time and maybe your company's resources. So that can be fully automated. And then the next part, so why, how? What is necessary in order to automate that? Again, this piece is conceptually very simple. The vulnerability has a description that says it affects these products, these hardware products, these software products in version X, Y, and Z. And then the question becomes, do you know if you have those products in those versions installed? And this is where an OT asset management system comes in, an OT asset inventory, because this is something that you cannot figure out manually. So you can, as part of the vulnerability management process, you cannot then, you have seen that in the CISA advisory, and now you check if you are, if you actually have those products. No, that's not going to work. So you need a decent OT asset inventory. And then the next step where some struggle is that, we have that very nice inventory, and it exposes our software products, firmware products, but unfortunately for the vulnerabilities, it shows us probabilities and likelihoods. Yes, that's true. That's bad, because that doesn't get you much further. Since now you are left with the task, is this actually real? So my OT asset inventory tells me that there is a possibility. It's possible that I'm affected by this vulnerability, and that doesn't really give you much. So why do you see things like this? Well, the reason is simply because the product that you're using does not create an accurate and detailed OT asset inventory. And because there is this gray zone in identification of the devices in their versions and the installed products in their versions, it's possible, but you have to check that out. And that is absolutely useless. You will not be able to make any progress if you are still left with the task to figure out if that vulnerability that the product suggests is even real. So let's check out how it's done in the right way. So what you see here is the events page of OTBase. And we have selected the CVE view, new CVEs, new vulnerabilities within the last 30 days. And here you see all the latest stuff that dropped in. and now you can assess those vulnerabilities and figure out how mitigation would look like. And this is then, we'll get back to that later. This is another area, another functional area, the assessment piece. We will check out later which tools can help you in that regard. But let's stick with the identification first. So the big misconception that many people have when it comes to OT vulnerability management is, oh, we must focus on the latest vulnerabilities as they are exposed in those advisories from the vendors, from CISA, etc., because it's always about new vulnerability. This is what you see here. This is the latest, all the stuff that dropped in over the last 30 days. You can also turn it down to 7 days or 24 hours. But if you wanted to actually use that as the basis for your remediation, you would be fooled, or you would be fooling yourself, because that is just the tiny, tiny top of the tip of the iceberg of your attack surface. Because usually OT asset owners, they're facing a backlog of hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities. Yes, that's the sad reality. Sorry to break it to you. And just to remember that cycle that I showed you in the beginning. So you do the identification, the assessment, and then the remediation. Well, everybody knows you won't remediate all the vulnerabilities. So you are building up your technological depth over time, and that is going to turn into a problem. That means if you're only focusing on the latest and most severe vulnerabilities, you are doing it wrong. So you have to look at the big picture, and we'll get to that big picture in a second. But since we are here, the other thing I would like to point out is if you just look at this list here, just look at the latest that came in. What do you notice when you check out the descriptions? Isn't that funny? Google Chrome, Google Chrome, Google Chrome, Google Chrome, Google Chrome. And that would suggest to me, well, maybe that in this particular case, the task isn't even so difficult, the remediation, because apparently there are, I don't know, dozens of CVEs all related to Google Chrome. And that would tell me, as the OT security person, well, how about we just update all of our Google Chrome instances, or maybe we can even uninstall Google Chrome from a lot of devices. Which devices? Let's just check out this one. So OT-Best tells you right away what the affected devices are and where they are. Okay? So this is what you see right away. So you can go directly to the remediation, assuming that in this particular case, you know, Google Chrome, well, I can fix those problems by updating the browser or by simply deinstalling it. But again, this is only the tip of the iceberg. So if you want to see the real picture in OT-Base, you go to the workspace. And this is the list of all the vulnerabilities, all the CVEs that affect your installed base. And it's already pre-filtered. So for example, we have selected to not expose medium and low severity vulnerabilities. And we have selected to expose only those with known exploits. And that leaves us for 320 CVEs with known exploits. If I uncheck this box, then the number jumps up. So that's all the vulnerabilities, including the backlog. And that's the important point. So because the latest from the last week or so, it's irrelevant. Trust me, you will experience this. You will completely change your approach to vulnerability management once that you see reality as depicted here. Because you will understand quickly, well, just chasing the latest vulnerabilities, that's a waste of time. I will just, I will fix that celebrity vulnerability, but the real important shit, it's still unmitigated. And that is what you would see here. And usually those very nasty vulnerabilities, they go back many years, like 2016. We have an example here. Some go back to 2010 or even earlier. Well, why is that the case? Well, because you have so many obsolete versions and products in your OT infrastructure. And I mean, if I could give you another perspective, you can even display that as a 3D heat map, which shows you how those vulnerabilities make up your attack surface. And that's another way to view things, because you could see, well, you know, so those big objects here, maybe this would be a good starting point, right? So you see what CVEs they are, and anything that pops up in the third dimension, that tells you, well, there are critical devices involved. So devices labeled as critical for whatever reason, maybe safety, maybe business continuity, and or some of these devices are exposed to the internet. That's what the exposure number tells you right here. And again, if you want to see additional details, you would simply do a double click here, and then you would again see what those devices are, what the CVE is, etc. So that's a very good starting point to give you an idea of your attack surface. But when you get to actual remediation efforts, it is all based on this filtering, where you basically, so you apply your criteria, what you want to turn into remediation efforts, and that happens in this next table that I'm going to show you here, the vulnerabilities table. Like, this is your master work table for defining your remediation tasks. And now we are no longer looking at CVEs, we are looking at individual vulnerabilities. So therefore, what was one CVE in the previous table might now be a couple of hundred entries, because all the individual instances are exposed. And maybe the important thing here is that you can slice and dice this table in many different ways. But first, to give you an idea, you can already see by the color coding, okay, so this is complex shit that's going on here. All that brown and yellow and red stuff, that relates to the CVE part. And the other columns, they relate to the instance, to the device. And then I can use this master table to apply my filter criteria, which basically define things like criticality, what I think, or risk, if you will, what I think should be remediated first. It's all about, that's what prioritization is about. So you're not saying, oh, the lower priority stuff, well, we will never touch that. You say, well, we might be able to do that later, but you always are dealing with extremely limited resources in OT security, and in the interest of spending those resources in a meaningful manner, you will try to focus on the most important stuff first. And that can easily be done. So this table is, again, pre-filtered by KEV. That means vulnerabilities with known exploits. That leaves me with 28,000 vulnerabilities. If I turn this off, then the number will be much higher, as you're going to see. And so that gives you one angle. So now we're talking about almost 1 million vulnerabilities, and that's a real thing. So don't even think about, no, that's bogus. They're making shit up. No, you're not making shit up. This is real life data that you'll see in production environments. The other thing that I want to point you to is to apply your filter criteria in a sensible manner. So maybe what you have noticed is, once that I've turned the KEV filter off, now I see those Rockwell PowerFlex vulnerabilities. They weren't shown earlier, simply because there is no known exploit for those vulnerabilities. And that's a very interesting observation to keep in mind. If you only filter for KEV, you will never see vulnerabilities in automation products, because at this point in time, certainly that can change tomorrow, there are no known exploits for vulnerabilities in automation products. But that does not mean that you should totally dismiss those vulnerabilities in your automation products. So just keep that in mind. There are no non-exploited vulnerabilities for PLCs, drives, RTUs, etc. If you want to factor them in anyway, and just because you want to know what is out there, what does affect my drives as an example, then you would turn this thing off here, this checkbox. And the other thing that you can do then with this table, you can apply dozens of filters. Let's just stick with the drives or with any automation device here. So if you think a step ahead, meaning you think about remediation, then it's certainly clear that firmware updates for those automation devices must be applied locally by local staff. That is not something that the OT security manager in HQ could do remotely. So in that interest, what you would probably do is you would limit the scope to specific locations. So for example, we could say, now we only want to focus on vulnerabilities in a specific site, or you could even further break that down into a specific building, as an example. Okay, and then that leaves you with just roughly 90K vulnerabilities in that building. And you can then further break that down. Let's just sort that by CVSS base core for starters. And you see, there's a lot of base core 10. That's bad. That's really bad. And again, just look at the descriptions: Adobe Flash, Adobe Flash, Adobe Flash. So my point is, friends, if you actually check out these various views into your attack surface, you will quickly get the idea of where to start. You will identify low-hanging fruits that will make a difference. And that is only possible if you have that realistic visibility, just like that, without having to browse through security advisories, or without having to figure out, well, that it says there's a likelihood of 0.5. So now you are supposed to spend a couple of hours of figuring out if that vulnerability is real. That's nonsense. It doesn't work that way. So if you start out with a decent database, then you will get insights quickly. You will find angles on how to approach your remediation, and thereby significantly shrinking your attack surface. Let me give you a couple of other examples. So for the attack vector, we say, okay, for the time being, for our prioritization effort, we just focus on anything that is remotely exploitable. In order to do that, I set the attack vector, that's a property of the CVE, to network. That means remotely exploitable. And then, guess what? Just 40,000 vulnerabilities have been shaved off. I like that. Attack complexity, I set this too low because I'm worried mostly about all that stuff that doesn't require a lot of effort to exploit. Then I'm left with 36,000 vulnerabilities. And so it goes on and on. And again, let's just say, for the sake of the argument, we want to focus on automation equipment first because we are a little bit worried about that stuff. We probably know already that our network segmentation isn't where it should be. And then I could say, okay, let's just focus on automation devices. Hey, 52 vulnerabilities. I love it. I just love it, right? And then just look at the descriptions. Very good example, in my opinion, down here. You have something about the micrologics. That's easy to fix. Certainly, well, you still have to do your firmware update, but I would just guess that the micrologics doesn't do vital tasks, right? So it's not required, certainly not required for the safety of your process. So that gives you an idea how this actually works. And then you can put this into what we call a managed view or safe view. Okay, so that is like automation devices in body in white, in the body in white building. And then we save those settings. And that results in two things to happen. First of all, I am now able to pull up this view in this drop-down right away, right? So automation devices, there it is. Let's just say I jump to a different view. And now if I want to go back to my automation devices, then I just need to click here and bang, there you have it. Now, the other important thing is that this is now our entry point into the remediation, because in the remediation tasks section in OT-Base, I can now set up a remediation task for my guys in that building, for the control engineers in that building, because they are supposed to fix this. So automation devices in BIW, schedule, let's just say, no, I want this to be done rather quickly. Remediation is obvious, that is an update. We know it's about automation devices, and if you update the firmware, then you are good. Let's just say start is today, end is, well, I give them until the end of this month. Downtime is required, unfortunately. And then I can assign the users. I know that my guy Ranjit is in charge there in that building, and that's basically it. Okay, so now I have a new remediation task. My guy Ranjit knows about this. Timeline will be filled as data comes in. So you will see in the timeline, you will see how remediation processes over time. I will show you how that works in a second. We see the vulnerabilities. We see the devices, the affected devices. We see the CVEs that are reference, and certainly the assigned user. So this is how that works. And just to give you an idea about that timeline that I've mentioned earlier, this is how such a timeline looks. So the timeline is maintained by OT-Base in 4 different dimensions, if you will. So down here, at the bottom, we have the number of remediated devices. So that's still at 0, unfortunately. So our friend Mohammed hasn't done shit so far. Mohammed, what's going on there? So, and you should be ready in a couple of days, right? Also end of month. This is the red line here. The green line is start of the task. And the number of vulnerable devices were actually, so we can see here that in 2023 that was bumped up. So the history goes way back that we provide for these devices, or for these vulnerabilities. Number of vulnerable devices, we have talked about that earlier. Number of vulnerabilities, and the V-score, that's like the accumulated CVSS base scores for all the vulnerable devices. So nothing much has happened, and we need to check on our guy Mohammed to see what's going on, because we want to see that addressed. So that is basically how you would implement the OT vulnerability management workflow in OT-Base. And as you have seen, while you cannot fully automate this task, certainly you cannot automate remediation. Well, you can do a lot of things to make the process easier, and especially you can do a lot of things to make it even meaningful, because if you do it like the majority, like more than 90% of OT security staff, you will never make progress. Sorry to break that to you. If you start with browsing through those advisories, and then if you're using a tool that tells you, oh, probably you're affected by that CVE, you will never make progress. You're fooling yourself and others. If you want to learn more about this whole approach and how you can achieve effective OT vulnerability management, I would like to point you to a resource that we have created on our resources page. There you will find the OT Vulnerability Management Handbook, where you can find a lot of these topics that I have addressed in this webcast, and you will get some additional context. So that was what I wanted to talk about today, and I will see you again next week, same place, same time. Bye-bye.